After the Second World War and Germany's defeat in the war, two powerful countries emerged in the world, the US representing the West and the Soviet Union representing the East. Now the world witnessed the competition that the show of power was intended to put on display. It was a show for war for world leadership. But the result of the leadership hinged on the outcome of the war that the two countries planned to start by relying on military organizations such as Nato. And now the rest of the story. It is December 1979. The Soviet Union has mobilized its forces to enter Afghanistan. Afghanistan has recently been involved in a rebellion against the country's communist leader. Endangering the area controlled by the Soviet Union gives the country's army the thumbs up to resort to violence. The Soviet Army's measures, which results in the deaths of over 1 million Afghans and the displacement of more to safe areas, made the US more and more worried about the power displays of its rival. The US presidency has now reached the stubborn man who is not willing to make any changes around him. Before entering the White House, Jimmy Carter was a farmer in a field full of peanuts in a remote village in southern US. The new US leader, whose skepticism in politics has held him back from many programs in the eyes of Americans, now needs to step in to show his power in the region. 2 years ago, when the Carter administration completely cut off its support to Pakistan due to concerns over its nuclear program, it had no idea it would one day need this country. Carter has to make up his mind. The situation that has arisen in Afghanistan can easily pin the Soviet Union to the ground. The US needs to make the most of this opportunity. A change in policy of friendship with Pakistan is the best option. Direct US aid to Pakistan will resume. Pakistan should become a conduit for US forces to push Afghanistan's anti-Soviet efforts. It didn't take long for Carter to issue a written order to the CIA to deliver weapons to the Afghan Mujahideen through Pakistan so they could teach the Soviets a lesson. This is a secret operation and no one knows about it. In the meantime, Pakistan also benefits from the situation when the responsibility of distributing US aid to the Afghan guerrillas falls on the shoulders of the Pakistani government. The friendly neighbor of Afghanistan was put in charge of controlling the distribution and the use of US military resources. The US policy towards Afghans is not going to change even with a change of power in the White House. As Carter's presidency ends, former American actor Ronald Reagan takes over politics.
Well, Jack Curtiz in person.
That's the trouble with you actors, Ronnie. No appreciation for what we directors do to make you look good.
Reagan tries to establish friendlier relations with Pakistan. The cordial ties are strengthened by the U.S. government's $3.2 billion offer and authorization to purchase F-16 fighter jets. Pakistan, which is addicted to the U.S. reward, can rule the region with these fighter planes, which were previously only available to NATO allies and Japan. But finally, the covert U.S. support to the rebels will pay off, and the Soviet army will fail to rule over the Afghans. The Soviet Union no longer has the ability to resist, and it feels ashamed to retreat. The war continues until 1987, when Mikhail Gorbachev, with all his reform ideas, took over the leadership of the Soviet Union. Gorbachev's policy of retreating from war and force made the Soviet soldiers withdraw from Afghanistan in droves. In early 1989, when the last soldiers of Gorbachev's army left Afghan territory, they left the country with all the poverty and destruction they had created for it during this time. Gorbachev withdrew his forces from Afghanistan, but he was not aware that during this period he empowered a rebel group of Afghans. The group stood against the Soviets despite the presence of leaders in Afghanistan. One of those groups was the Taliban. The Taliban intended to get closer to a militant group called Al-Qaeda. Al-Qaeda, led by Osama bin Laden, considered Afghanistan as its refuge and turned the country into a base for recruitment, training, and planning attacks on U.S. interests. The White House was terrified. Now, Afghanistan became a security priority for the U.S., which they had to do something about as soon as possible. September 11th, 2001, New York. The dawn had not broken yet for the Americans when some news was circulating. It was about the hijacking of 4 commercial and passenger planes with all of their passengers.
1 American 11, we don't know where the aircraft is going. Then we lost this transponder, and now the aircraft is headed due south.
Oh my goodness.
You have no idea where he's going? No idea, sir. Okay.
Thank you.
Minutes later, some other news broke out like a bombshell. 2 hijacked planes hit the Twin Towers of the World Trade Center in New York at different intervals.
Looks like 6, 7 floors were taken out. And there's more explosions right now. Hold on, people are running. Hold on.
on just a moment. We got an explosion.
The dimensions of the incident were so large that it shocks everyone. The number of people killed in the plane and in the building was much higher than people could imagine. After 2 hours, both buildings completely
the firemen assembled
collapsed.
here, the police officers, FBI agents, and you can see the two towers. A huge explosion now, raining debris on all of us. We better get out of the way.
Media censorship began. No one knew exactly the dimensions of the incident. Everything was suspicious. Fear gripped the American people. What was this all about? The U.S. government must be held accountable. A few days later, the White House reacts to the incident and pins it on Al-Qaeda. In the eyes of the U.S. statesman, it was Al-Qaeda that should have prepared itself to respond to America. Accountability, which according to everyone, has no other option but war.
Whether we bring our enemies to justice or bring justice to our enemies, justice will be done.
The 43rd U.S. president had recently taken office, George W. Bush, the son of the former president of the United States. Bush was involved in a bad incident at the beginning of his presidency. Just days after the attack on the Twin Towers, he called up tens of thousands of reservists during the war. Bush decided to go to war with Afghanistan. Although the U.S. reasons for involvement of Al-Qaeda in the attack on the U.S. have not yet been investigated, American bombers were preparing for a long-range bombing campaign, and equipment, naval groups, and bombers were pre-positioning in the war zone. On September 14th, U.S. Congress approves the use of military force against terrorists. A few days later, Bush, relying on this government authorization, in his speech to the Taliban group, made it clear they must close the terrorist training camp in Afghanistan and hand over all Al-Qaeda leaders hiding in the country to American authorities.
And tonight, the United States of America makes the following demands on the Taliban. Deliver to United States authorities all the leaders of Al-Qaeda who hide in your land. Close immediately and permanently every terrorist training camp in Afghanistan, and hand over every terrorist and every person in their support structure to appropriate authorities.
However, the Taliban had no intention of holding Al-Qaeda responsible for the attack on the U.S. They did not trust the White House at all. Therefore, they proposed that all documented evidence proving bin Laden's involvement in this matter be given to them so that Al-Qaeda's case can be reviewed in court composed of Islamic scholars.
There is no evidence in proof given to us that we will not be ready to give Osama bin Laden without any proof.
But the U.S. refuses to agree to the demand and hears from the Taliban leaders that bin Laden has disappeared. The White House, failing to achieve any results from the negotiations, prepares itself for an attack on Afghanistan, an attack that American officials believe requires the support of other countries. Thus, the Bush administration announced in international relations to the countries of the region that they must adhere to only one group, either the U.S. or the terrorist groups. Immediately, NATO also gets involved. For the first time in its history, its members activated Article 5 of their treaty, which allowed all member countries to enter the field to defend the U.S.
The Council agreed that an armed attack against one or more of the Allies in Europe or in North America shall be considered an attack against them all.
5 days after the announcement, NATO deploys its permanent Mediterranean naval forces and aircraft.
Let's go! Let's go!
Only 2 weeks after the September 11th attacks, the first group of CIA operational forces, using their connections with Afghan opponents, entered Afghanistan. They acted as quickly as possible and, after gathering information, reinforced local alliances for America's attack on the country. Once everything was prepared for U.S. Special Operations Forces, they entered Afghanistan.
You have no right, no authority. Yeah, right there, put that in your notes. Put that in your notes.
Number of Taliban members is more than the Americans had imagined. Therefore, the Pentagon prepares to fully engage U.S. military forces in the conflict. On September 20th, U.S. announces the start of military reinforcement by sending ground and air forces to attack Afghanistan. However, the White House officials faced a serious problem that would not hinder them from any quick action. The U.S., for the war with landlocked Afghanistan, needs the help of neighboring countries. One of these neighbors is Iran, whose leader does not allow war, and another, Pakistan, whose officials are only willing to cooperate at a very high price. Despite these problems, Afghanistan does not have favorable terrain for fighting. The numerous choke points created solely due to long distances, severe terrain roughness, and very weak transportation infrastructure makes the task difficult and challenging for the U.S. Army. The Americans had to confront the Taliban in any way possible.
Carnage in New York and Washington has raised the struggle to a new level. Pakistan has been extending cooperation to international efforts to combat terrorism in the past and will continue to do so in the future.
Although in the attack, U.S. managed to win the approval of Pakistan and Uzbekistan, it was still afraid that history will repeat itself. U.S. officials had not forgotten Afghanistan's past and the presence of Soviet forces there. The Communist War on the Afghan soil had mobilized the world against the Soviet Union. The U.S. knew that to avoid the fate of the Soviet Union, it must reduce its presence in the war. Therefore, it refrained from sending more ground forces.
Good afternoon. On my orders, the United States military has begun strikes against al-Qaeda terrorist training camps and military installations of the Taliban regime in Afghanistan. These carefully targeted actions are designed to disrupt the use of Afghanistan as a terrorist base of operations and to attack the military capability of the Taliban regime.
American and NATO forces, in collaboration with some Afghan militias, begin their attack. Taliban positions in northern Afghanistan were chosen for the assault. It didn't take long for American ground forces to destroy the Taliban positions, paving the way for initial attacks by local Afghan militias. These militias, riding horses and armed with weapons from their country's war with the Soviets, opened the way.
No, we do not control the fort. We control one end. I think it's the north end. There's hundreds dead here, at least. I don't know how many Americans are.
Once the American army secured northern Afghanistan, their attention shifted to the south and east of the country where the Taliban wielded power. During this time, an Afghan individual officially began his support for the U.S., and that was Hamid Karzai. In December of the same year, the American army defeated the Taliban and handed over Kandahar, the Taliban's bastion, to Karzai. Soon after, Kabul was also purged from Taliban presence without conflict. Simultaneously, the news of the American Army's victory in Afghanistan was accompanied by reports of a major meeting being held at the Petersburg Hotel in Bonn, Germany. The meeting aimed to find a roadmap for a new Afghanistan under the supervision of the United Nations.
Let's hope that history will record this day as the beginning of a new age for Afghanistan.
ما در مراسم افتتاحیه عنوان کردیم که با صمیمیت، با قاطعیت به این نیت آمدیم که کشور عزیز خود را از مرحله بحران کنونی به صلح و ثبات انتقال بدیم، با ایثار و فداکاری و با خودگذری در این امر کشور ما را به مرحله جدید و نوین از او که در او صلح، در او اعتدال، در او دموکراسی، در او حقوق بشر، حقوق زن و زیستن در کنار جامعه بین المللی باشه انتقال بدیم.
On December 22, 2001, the Karzai government was formed with U.S. support. The U.S. intended to fully transfer power to Karzai by pressuring the Afghans. The White House believed it would prevent the influence of local Afghan warlords. Washington believed it had found the perfect person to govern Afghanistan.
This will be a government based on the Constitution of Afghanistan and in respect of the Constitution of Afghanistan.
Karzai, under the protective wings of the White House, was known to everyone as a new form of governance in the country, contrary to Afghan tribal customs. The White House should not trust Karzai. However, as the U.S. Army advanced in the war, it became less successful in reaching al-Qaeda. It was unclear where the group had taken refuge. It turned the heads of White House analysts. There were many analyses on the president's desk, some blaming the U.S. Army for the problem. The American Army handed over the mission of hunting down bin Laden and al-Qaeda to local militias, but they failed to capture them. Critics of the U.S. Army claimed that these militias had made a deal with al-Qaeda, allowing them to cross the border and take refuge in western Pakistan. The CIA had warned from the beginning to close routes that would help them escape from Afghanistan. Although the American Army managed to defeat the Taliban in a short time, its plan for post-war victory was unclear. The White House officials and their think tanks had never considered which group would take power after the Taliban to stabilize the country and prevent terrorist groups from taking refuge. In this war, although the Taliban were weakened, they were not completely eliminated. The U.S. knew this very well. After this defeat, the Taliban decided to make changes in their approach, becoming a more complex and determined enemy for America. It didn't take long for George Bush to appear in public and announce America's next move. Confident from polls showing 75% public approval of the war, he spoke with more confidence about the second phase of the conflict. He intended to prepare his army to eliminate terrorists in other countries.
Our enemy is a radical network of terrorists and every government that supports them.
When Bush talked about escalating violence in Afghanistan, no one knew what was happening behind closed doors in the White House. One of these senior officials was the Secretary of Defense, Donald Rumsfeld. On the same morning that Bush presented his ideas for the future of the war, Rumsfeld was deeply thinking at the Pentagon. Standing behind his desk on the third floor of a building in the outer ring of the White House, he thought about an army now stuck in Afghanistan with no clear exit strategy. He knew very well that Bush had his own concerns. Although U.S. generals did not dare admit that the Taliban could not be defeated, Rumsfeld decided to write a confidential note about the bad situation of the U.S. in the war and hide it among his handwritten notes. He preferred to go among the people and talk about America's successes in the war during those years.
The President of the United States and General Franks and I have been looking at the progress that's being made in this country, and in cooperation with President Karzai have concluded that we're at a point where we clearly have moved from major combat activity to a period of stability and stabilization and reconstruction and activities.
Rumsfeld smiles as he mingles with the people, unaware that a press conference is about to be held across the borders in Afghanistan, where American war commanders will, for a first time, reveal the realities about the continuation of the war. When the first phase of the war in Afghanistan ends, American forces reduce their presence in the country. There are no more frequent orders from the White House to the military forces. The war commanders in this country are left to their own devices. However, the media has yet to shift its attention away from this country. It doesn't take long before it is announced that a press conference with the war commanders will be held in Washington. The topic, which had been kept quiet until that day, grabs everyone's attention. In this conference, General David McKiernan, commander of the U.S. forces in Afghanistan, stands in front of the cameras and for the first time speaks about new issues in the war. He claims that the U.S. has made no progress in large parts of Afghanistan. In his view, this is a tough war.
It's going to be a tough year. There are the baseline problems of poverty and literacy and violence. That's not going to turn around quickly.
Now all concerns are shifted to the outcome of a war initiated by the U.S. president. A president who not only has no plan for the post-war situation in Afghanistan, but also has no clear idea of how the Afghan war can contribute to the global war on terrorism.
Mr. Speaker, the President of the Transitional Islamic State of Afghanistan.
In January 2002, U.S. Congress is held with special guests in attendance. Hamid Karzai, the new president of Afghanistan. Karzai's position next to the First Lady of the United States, Laura Bush, gives him more courage. Bush's speech begins. Everyone knows that his topic will be the future of Afghanistan. In his speech, after praising the spirit of the Afghan people, Bush announces that America will partner in the reconstruction of this country.
We will also support programs to train new police officers and to help establish and train an Afghanistan national military. The United States is also committed to playing a leading role in the reconstruction of Afghanistan.
This requires sustaining and accelerating the reconstruction of Afghanistan through long-term commitment, a free trade agreement between the United States and Afghanistan, and providing incentives to the private sector for investing in Afghanistan. We must enhance our strategic partnership. The security of our two nations are intertwined.
With a smile of satisfaction on Karzai's bearded face, lawmakers in Congress give him a standing ovation. Karzai immediately takes his woolen hat in hand and bows in respect. After this speech, everyone now understands that the U.S. has rolled up its sleeves for nation building in Afghanistan. But the nation building seems to be very costly for the U.S. After Bush's speech, American Reconstruction organizations enter Afghanistan. These organizations, which outnumber American military personnel, direct all their actions to serve the military objectives of the U.S. Gradually, NATO's support for the reconstruction teams in Afghanistan begins. In December 2001, with order of the UN Security Council, international forces are formed to ensure the security of areas inside and around Kabul. This force officially comes under NATO's command 2 years later. The Security Council increases the powers of the organization. Now, under NATO leadership, the organization quickly takes charge of its reconstruction team in Kunduz under German supervision. The provinces of Afghanistan inevitably come under the control of this organization, which has become part of NATO. However, there is a fundamental problem. The excessive power given to Karzai by the U.S. is becoming problematic. The White House is quite helpless. It has no choice but to turn a blind eye to Karzai's corruption. Karzai, who resists reforms and insists on appointing his own people to different positions while they have no expertise. The situation for the Afghan people is getting worse by the day. Poverty and illiteracy are rampant in Afghanistan. The rate of migration from the country increases. Former American officials get worried about the situation and in interviews said the goals of the war were unrelated to the 9/11 attacks. They all have only one question for the Bush administration. Was America's goal in the war to punish Al-Qaeda or install a corrupt government that needs billions of dollars in aid from America for its survival? Meanwhile, some news about the 9/11 incident is also circulating among Americans, an incident that had authorized the entry of the American Army into Afghanistan. In June 2006, the English newspaper, the Daily Mail, reported that 75 American university professors believed that 2 passenger planes alone could not have destroyed the 2 World Trade Center towers. They argued that the burning jet fuel did not provide enough heat to melt steel. Images after the incident showing white smoke around the buildings led American intellectuals to argue that the explosion might have been caused by incendiary materials rather than the plane crashes.
When I first saw the collapses, I was absolutely convinced that they were not spontaneous. One of the first things that I did was to speak with one of my patients who is a retired Army Corps of Engineers fellow who's done a lot of demolition and construction. Showed him some of the public source videos that are available of it, and he immediately pointed out that there were squibs, which represent little puffs of smoke essentially coming out of the buildings initially, which were clearly a sign of controlled demolition. He had no opinions beyond that, but he said without doubt that it was a controlled demolition. That sort of set me on the path of continuing to examine it and trying to gather as much evidence as I could.
The group of professors, calling themselves 9/11 Truth, claim that the facts in their research are undeniable. They allege the greatest conspiracy in history had occurred, one that they believe was not planned solely in the caves of Afghanistan.
A building cannot do free fall with 40,000 tons of structural steel in its structural system without it being blown up.
These professors suggested that the attack might have been part of the project for the new American century and the U.S.'s dominance over the world, which had now brought American forces to West Asia. However, the situation in Afghanistan worsened in 2006 and the security situation deteriorated. The Taliban launched a widespread offensive with attacks across the south and to a lesser extent in the east, gradually taking control of rural areas. They aim to prepare for more aggressive attacks by targeting remote security outposts. The widespread attacks, which cut off roads and communication lines, included suicide bombings and car blasts against local officials and government targets. The Taliban were rapidly recruiting fresh forces. Washington could not handle the Taliban. In 2007, the U.S. and its allies faced a full-scale insurgency in Afghanistan. That year, 232 foreign troops were killed in the country, the highest annual number since the U.S. invasion. By the end of 2008, the annual death toll had risen to 295 foreign troops. The U.S. pinned its hopes on NATO, expecting the organization to help. However, Bush faced problems with its allies during those years. NATO members were deeply divided over managing Afghanistan, believing the White House had ignored them with its decisions in the region. Since 2003, when President Bush decided to send troops to Iraq to confront Saddam Hussein, the U.S. has shifted its focus away from Afghanistan.
The Iraqi regime has plotted to develop anthrax and nerve gas and nuclear weapons for over a decade.
The U.S. was a leader of NATO members. Without its presence in Afghanistan, the organization would fall apart, and NATO members knew this well. The U.S. presidency was now handed down to this African-American man, Barack Obama. Inheriting two wars in Africa and Iraq from George Bush, he had to shape his policies around these conflicts.
I want the American people to understand that we have a clear and focused goal: to disrupt, dismantle, and defeat Al-Qaeda.
In 2011, U.S.-Pakistan relations deteriorated. The U.S. suspected Pakistan of harboring bin Laden. Pakistan, meanwhile, was tired of the U.S. military's movements.
They ran into Pakistan, the Al-Qaeda and Taliban. They ran into the mountains and cities of Pakistan.
Sometime earlier, when NATO attacked a Pakistani checkpoint to control the flow of supplies to insurgents in Afghanistan, dozens of Pakistani soldiers were killed. Pakistani leaders strongly condemned the attack, closed supply routes for NATO, and eventually limited U.S. drone operations from Pakistani soil. This action seriously hampered U.S. moves in the war.
Another day of anger on the streets of Pakistan. And in the capital, as Pakistan's foreign minister reportedly says when it comes to the United States, enough is enough. A feeling echoed in these protests.
In June 2011, Obama appeared on television to announce the gradual withdrawal of U.S. troops from Afghanistan. This announcement by the president came a few months after bin Laden was killed in Pakistan. The American public supported the decision.
Tonight, I can report to the American people and to the world that the United States has conducted an operation that killed Osama bin Laden, the leader of Al-Qaeda.
On December 28, 2014, American and NATO officials held a ceremony at their headquarters in Kabul to broadcast a message to the world. A multinational group marched with colorful flags as a four-star general respectfully lowered the green flag of the International Security Assistance Force, which had been raised since the beginning of the Afghanistan war. General John Campbell, the 57-year-old commander of U.S. and NATO forces, announced the end of the combat mission in Afghanistan at the ceremony.
We have not forgotten why we are here and will not waver from our long-term commitment. We will continue both our counterterrorism mission and our train, advise, and assist mission to build a sustainable Afghan security force that can stand on its own and secure Afghanistan from violent extremism and terrorism.
When Obama's written statement was read at the ceremony, no one applauded or endorsed his words.
My short message today is this: I know you. You have brought only hardship and suffering to the Afghan people.
Obama's policies had not pulled America out of its quagmire in Afghanistan. The Taliban were still advancing in the country. Statistics from these years of U.S. military presence in Afghanistan continued to mount. The human and financial costs of the war were undeniable. The effects of the war in Afghanistan were not limited to the destruction of infrastructure and the environment. Unexploded bombs, lack of food security, economic collapse, destruction of healthcare infrastructure, and the Afghan migration to neighboring countries all called into question the performance of the U.S. and NATO over the years. To save the Afghan people from poverty and illiteracy, the U.S. even refused to return Afghanistan's confiscated assets. American news agencies gradually reported more worrying statistics.
What type of weapons did the U.S. leave behind in Afghanistan? It was an unceremonious exit, to say the least. An image of the last US soldier leaving Afghanistan, marking the end to America's 20-year war.
Billions of dollars worth of advanced weapons left behind by the departing Americans remained in the country. What would happen if these weapons fell into the hands of terrorist groups whose numbers had risen to over 20 after the US withdrawal? Although Obama, influenced by the policies of his White House advisors, did not completely withdraw his forces from the country, everyone knew that the full potential of the U.S. military was being spent on the war that had been raging in Iraq for several years. The U.S. sought to focus all of its attention on the Iraq War, and now NATO's story was set to continue in Iraq.